Anyway, so I wanted to explain first a little bit more of general context. So I started really as a typographer, as a type designer to make typefaces and fonts. So these are just some typefaces that I made, but basically most of the fonts and letters that I've designed, they always come into relation to a project. So I never designed typefaces for just the sake of designing typeface, but a lot of the books that you see here around also have specific fonts designed for a specific project. And over the years I started collaborating a lot with artists from all different kinds of fields, contemporary artists mainly that are like same age or that are friends, and started collaborating with them on artist books, where the book forms part of their praxis, or even the book is the exhibition. So I will show you some examples of how different works reach into different directions as well. Come on. And most of these books, I mean, talking a little bit about the context also of these artist books, there's a strong tradition in artist publications from the 50s and 60s that try to use the medium as a book to escape out of the white cube, or to escape out of the museum. So to use publications as an experimental format for concepts and ideas that try to escape from the museum context. Most of the books that I've worked on, they try to extend on this history and then try to make it be more crazy, or to try to experiment more with the narrative or with the structure of it. Anyway, these are other typefaces, but these are many of the books that I made. But I would like to go through some specific examples. So one is this one that you actually can see here. You can all have a look at it. Because it's an example of how to work on an actual book with an artist that is not like the classical setup of because I come in as a designer and then I collaborate with someone and we start a dialogue. And most of the time, what I always try to do is also to extend the collaboration and what does it mean to make a book, and what does it mean to make that project with that person. So this is one example is a collaboration that I did over several years with an artist called Nora Schulz. And we invented like a printing machine, which you can basically see here on the back. It's like this metal rod, it's like 2 meters long. And on this metal rod, we basically put like stuff through. But the idea was that you can also put objects through, and for this you can make these endless prints. So we were basically just having fun and then putting like different objects through the machine, putting different inks and like filling up the space. And the idea was then also that these prints of these objects, that they basically become the exhibition. So the process very much of making these prints is also the end of the exhibition. So what you see on the cover here is actually I made a typeface from this kind of sponge and bended it in different direction to make also the letter shapes. No? And in the book, then over the years, we put this exhibition in different places. So I document it and I take photographs. And then Laura, she does a lot of like audio recording, and then she carves on like different materials. Like for example, these are yoga mats, where she then carves on, and writes different letters, and then we put them through the machine again, and we make these prints. So when we wanted to make the book, we also wanted to have a more fluid process of how do you edit this book and how do you put together this information of the process of the work and the actual exhibition in the format of a publication. So what we did there is basically we take all the pictures that I took and we make a layout, and then Nora afterwards she started drawing on top of the layout. And then afterwards, I started adding other documentation again on the book, on the same layout, and then she wrote a text that starts from the beginning of the book until the end, explaining the whole process. So that way also the way how the book ended up as a narrative, it was also a collaboration in the sense we were like going through different stages and different mediums and formats. And then inside we also had like sections of the prints or texts and poems that she then wrote that also try to explain the project. So it's an example of how you can basically, in a different way, like also think about that format and how you can experiment with that. One of the reasons of that, of course, is like design or graphic design in that sense tries to always pin down certain traditions or certain ways that of how things are done, but of course these ways they don't necessarily work for contemporary art, which might have another meaning in 10 years or in 20 years or in 30 years. So the question like, how does that documentation even have an impact or a meaning by a work that's like so different also in the approach than, for example, a classical painting or something. So most of the books that I did, they try to play with this, and the other ones you see that they also have this kind of experiments and they have this kind of approach. I will not go into more books because there's a lot of them I made. I think over around 250 books with different artists, and most of them they have this approach. But we're going to be here for hours if I try and talk to you about this until you get bored. It's better if you just pick up and have a specific question if you're interested. I'm very happy also to explain you how it's done or how it's made or what it is about. Yes?
How do you work with the publisher? Because now you're explaining how you work with the artist.
Yes.
Which is very interesting, but at what point does some adults get in the room to say, let's do my pictures, that's too expensive, whatever?
Yes, yeah. So for example, in this case, I also founded my own publishing house.
So you sold that
already a while ago. So this book specifically is published in my publishing house. And what we try to do in the publishing house is called Bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite, which means good morning, good afternoon, good night. And the idea is that it's in Portuguese, but the idea is also that the books and the projects that are made there, they form part of your everyday life. So they become part of something that's real, not something that is like forced in the sense of just making the book, but the books that they become closer also to the people who read it or the people who use it or the work that is actually inside the books. And in Bom dia we specifically try to publish books that have these questions that are problematic about publishing or that other publishers don't dare to do. But I've also worked a lot with other publishers that are more commercial and also published many books with other publishing houses, not only mine. I still do that, I still work as a designer with other publishers. I'm making a huge leap from the design work and from the print work. I want to show you that this is another collaboration I've been doing for many years now already. Since 2004, I work with a fashion label called Bless. They're based in Paris and Berlin, and they do every 6 months also a regular collection. So for every collection, I also design like the image, you know, like how it's communicated. So sometimes I do collages, but they do like shows every 6 months of the new collection. So this collection, for example, was a show where people were doing yoga. So people are invited to the show, but then people are doing yoga, and then the people who are doing yoga are wearing the clothes. So afterwards, I make this kind of psychedelic collages where people like bodies are kind of interacting and they're upside down, and the postcards and the image you can also turn it into different directions. This was another show where we made a boxing event where they made a machine where instead of a keyboard like for a computer, you wouldn't have a keyboard, but you would have those boxing things. So each thing in the box would have a key to type or a sentence. So then also like the typography is also a little bit like that, no? It like plays with these ideas. Or this is another one where we made like an art drawing class. This is one where we had like sheets in the show, and then the people were hanging out in space on the sheets, but then the whole collection was also with a lot of wool because it was a winter collection.
At what point do you start a conversation with them? Or they start drawing the collection?
Because we already worked now so closely together for such a long time, we always talk to each other, and I know what they're up to, and sometimes they bring me in early, sometimes not, sometimes I'm not so involved. It depends, every season it's different, it depends on what's going on.
What's exactly your title, for instance? with Bless? You're what? You're a designer? You're what?
I'm a long-term collaborator. So this was another show we made they made in Paris, but then like we made so I don't want to go so much into details because it's possibly like too much. But for each collection, you generate images. You make this graphic design, then we take pictures, we document it, and at one point we also yes.
Sorry for interrupting. I just want to ask you, like, what's your biggest inspiration? What inspires you the most when you do?
For that, yeah, for that it's like shows. It's like I look at the collection and the people and what happened in the event, and then try to generate a graphic design from it.
But
now in this case, it's always the specific, like, because they really do every 6 months like a new collection. They show it, you know, and then there's an event created, and then from that event I try to think about how do you communicate that into print or into an image or into a postcard or into, you know. So for example, it depends, you know.
That's why I asked you, like, what inspires you the most?
Like in general?
In general.
What inspires me the most? I don't know, but for me really to inspire, it's mainly through more like human contact, no? So it's like personal, through people or conversation or things that I experience. Or space, you know, I don't know, or yeah. Like if you go to a bowl that you like, you never imagine that you can do something on that.
Yeah, definitely do something new.
But you know what I mean? It depends on the situation.
Yeah, it depends.
So, but it's more like the human contact that inspires more than or the dialogue, especially with them, with Ines and Desiree, who founded the label. It's really also the dialogue that I have with them over the years that we develop stuff. And that's inspiring also because we talk, you know, like what they did and what they did. Yes, and then how do you think further of bringing it further to the next level?
That's nice.
So for example, for the collections, normally the fashion industry, they always do like these lookbooks, which are publications every 6 months where we see all the new stuff and new collections. Now it's mainly on the internet, but we still do it in print. But because of the spirit of Bless, I also try to convince them that if we do it in print, we should always think also about the distribution of it, not just about the way it looks. So then we started basically with the idea of publishing the lookbooks in existing magazines. So this is a car magazine. And then we basically made like a bookmark inside that's lying inside, and then there you have the documentation of the presentation we made. And this presentation, they made like little remote controlled cars with speakers and like helicopters and drones, you know. So the lookbook we inserted it into a car magazine. Or this is another magazine. Normally they're not fashion magazines already. They're magazines outside of the fashion industry in order to expand also the horizon or the dialogue, you know? So for example, this is another magazine which is more art-based, and there we only printed black and white, so I made stickers, and then we stick the stickers inside so we also could have in color the stuff, you know? And in that way also we still maintain the distribution system of the magazine. So the people who buy the magazine, they get the lookbook, but also Bless has some copies to give to their clients or to the people that they work with.
But who goes and speak to those magazines? You?
It depends each time, but sometimes we have one in mind, or we think about one that we find interesting, and then we approach them, or sometimes we already know them. But over the years, it's like how many years we've done it with magazines for cooking, for cars, for photography, for like all kinds of stuff. But maybe not like fashion stuff. So like it escapes also out of this industry and it forms a new form of distribution. And then also we started collaborations which went even further to take those images that we generated back. Then each time from the collection before make a textile design for the next collection. So the lookbook before, what we already did in the graphic design, we then made like for the new collection, like I made a textile. So that way the images also re-enter again into the recycling. Yes, so it's like an endless cycle of recycling and reusing. And then most of the time, most of the models, they are friends. So suddenly most of the images, you have like the same people again, and then they appear again on the clothes, and they come in again. Sorry?
What? It's a joke. I said we want to make movies, make movies, and make recycling across the loop.
Yes, yes. They actually also make short films of each other.
That's so cool, man.
And so then this is an extension maybe from that I want to briefly talk about. Salma also asked me a bit. It's a collaboration with a French artist called Dominique Fosters. And Dominique, she did for a long time a piece of work. It's called the Apparitions, where she like takes on a character. So this is, for example, Callas, like a very famous singer. And she dresses up as her, and then she makes a video work. And she reenacts. So this is like Fitzcarraldo from Werner Herzog's movie, like a very famous classical movie, which is about the tropics. And so she dresses up as Fitzcarraldo, and then she makes an artwork out of it. And she did many of these. So she asked me to collaborate with her on an exhibition where we think about the way to display those costumes and those works in Berlin. And then I collaborated with her, and we basically made this space which has the different costumes floating around, and then they're hidden in the space, and the space is split up in different sections which relate to different essays that she's written about the different characters. And also for the show I designed like a chair which has basically a mold of Dominique's leg, and the other chair has Dominique's arm, and one is convex and the other one is concave. So when you sit on the chair, like you feel it, like either you sit like very deep, or you have the chair like really in your back, you know, and then you can feel a part of her leg or her arm there. And then sometimes these chairs get dressed with the clothing or with the objects. And in the downstairs space, we invited and also blessed the fashion label, and they make a new collection of the same characters, but clothing that you could wear when you go to the exhibition. So people could come to the exhibition, and then you leave your clothes, and then you basically could get dressed as Marilyn Monroe. So this is the changing room. It had a mirror on top. And then people could, there was also a hairdresser and a makeup artist, and then you could basically do a cosplay, which is like, you could dress up as Marilyn Monroe, or as any of the characters, a boy with green hair, and then move around with the exhibition as one of the characters. So that way also just like it becomes like more activated than through the people actually wearing stuff, and then like participating also through going through the space while wearing clothing. Okay, now this is another project I briefly wanted to talk about because it's a little bit more related to where I start. Basically, it's this book over there. So I had the chance to spend like longer periods of time in Brazil, and in Brazil with my partner, we met by chance. Rogério, we were wondering who's Rogério Duarte. It was a name that appeared in many places and many posters and graphic design that I really liked. So we started wondering, like, who is this guy, Rogério Duarte? Who is his name? Because no one knows about him, but he's always there. His name appears on album sleeves. So this is a very known singer in Brazil, Caetano Veloso, who's part of the Tropicalia movement. The Tropicalia movement, I don't know if you're familiar with it. But, no? But they basically, the Tropicalia movement, they tried to, it was more like 60s, just started around mid-60s, just before the dictatorship came into power in Brazil, and they were trying to bleed psychedelia and rock music with music that is much more from the tropical context, that also comes from the Carnival, from Bahia, which has a lot of influence from Medellin and from Anglais, and try to make that more in the Brazilian context. So Rogério was one of the founders as well of Tropicalia, and they did a lot of very emblematic albums. They talk about identity, they talk about the history of Brazil, they talk about the very obvious, this is Portuguese costume that he's wearing, of course, a military. And Rogério, he made all this graphic design, and I was astonished by it. I was like, this is amazing, like all the stuff that this guy did is crazy. So by accident we met him. He was living totally isolated in Bahia at the time, living from doing Sanskrit translations and just meditating in Hare Krishna. So, and he was already quite old at the time, but we met and we connected really well, and we had like really incredible time and exchange. And at the end of the day we spent together, he said to us like, I want you to come back, and I would like that you work on a book with me about the work I've done. And there were a lot of people in Brazil that tried to do that, but Rogério, he had the nickname was Rogério Chaos. So he was very anti. So he was always like try to go against the mainstream. So he was really part of creating a counterculture in Brazil, specifically in the 60s when also in the dictatorship. And so all this stuff is totally before computer. This is all like cutting with scissors and drawing by hand with acetates. This is computer didn't exist then. And a lot of these musicians, of course, became very famous, and he also collaborated with Lahlou Russia. If you never watched movies by Lahlou Russia, you should really look at them, because they talk a lot about, specifically this one, about the Deutschland, the soul. It's really about the identity and about the piece of land that's taken away also from the people. And it was very much a counterculture movement, and it was called Cine Novo. It was a bit like the French modéré cinema, but the Brazilian tropical version. And Rogério made this poster, which is the most known of his works. Probably hangs in many museums and many places, because the film became very important in Brazil. And Rogério was a very emblematic person in the sense that he was very close with artists like Manuel Reader. They had a very strong relationship. And he was collaborating with also constructing the Moderator, which is the Museum of Modern Artists, the park in front of Rio. So these are the posters he made, which I find particularly beautiful, because in the posters it says like, come and visit the park of Flamengo, and we have a beautiful permanent exhibition of birds. Come and visit the park of Flamengo, we have a beautiful permanent exhibition of fish. So he wrote a lot of poetry, and he also wrote a lot of lyrics for Tropicalia.
What you showed just before, is that what is this?
This is a magazine that he designed, and it was called Movimiento, and it was very important in forming the counterculture movement in Brazil, because this magazine was talking a lot about what was going on in Venezuela and Cuba at the time. And a lot of people who started writing for it, and also like doing drawings and photographs, they became really part of certain movements in Brazil. And a lot of it can be traced to this magazine. So it was very important. And Rogério, I always quote it because you can see a clear influence. He was very much influenced by Benzel and also by the Bauhaus and the history of Swiss typography. So he mixed a lot of like modernist influences, but then put them in a totally different context. So this is like a poem by him. You can all read it yourself. And he invented a lot of theories about mathematics and geometry. So he was interested in many different things, but things that there was never a book about bringing all these different influences together and the different stuff he did. So we spent basically 3-4 years with him trying to transcribe it, translate it, and the book that we have there is the result of it, like putting together the poems, the graphic design, the writing, like all those things into one, and talk about this person who was really important for Brazil. And so we managed to find funding first in Frankfurt, in Germany, in the museums, and they let us do an exhibition. And through that we could finance the book, and we also could, through that we could also bring Rogério to the first time to Germany, the first time he actually left Brazil. And we made the show there, and then of course also work on the display and how the show worked. And a couple of years later we could bring it back to Brazil, to the Museum of Modern Art. And that was really incredible because of course in the opening all the musicians they play live. So, but at the time Rogério was already quite sick, and shortly after also he passed away. Now I also put this drawing of him because it really talks also about that relationship we had with him, why we did this project, because it was really a project of love to him, and also how important he was as a person and how the exchange happened, and many stories. But there's so many stories about it. I could go on forever. I'll leave it there.
Please do.
I can tell you afterwards. I can tell you afterwards. But it's like, it was really incredible also to be with him when he was in Germany for 2 weeks basically with us. And
how did you work with like research translators you did in Brazil, you did in Frankfurt? What were you doing?
how did I work with him? We went to his house always.
Yeah, but like 3 months a year, and then you go back and you go together.
Yeah, even shorter, but then we would meet up and then we would talk about it. And then there was a lot of translation to be done for the book and transcribing. The main problematic was that he during the dictatorship, he was the first one to denounce publicly the military also. And most of his friends, they escaped. They left Brazil and they went into exile to France or to England, and he stayed in Brazil. And during that period, he became extremely paranoid. So in the early 70s or mid 70s, he started destroying a lot of his own works. So a lot of it we had to find again on flea markets and start looking for it again, or ask family members where we could find it. But he knew exactly what he did. So he knew exactly like, oh, this I did, and he would help us to try and find it, or to find out if it still existed, if he didn't have it.
And you showed him the results, and you comment on it, and you correct from his comments or not? How much freedom do you have regarding the artists in your own work?
Well, in his case, it's more about like he trusted us, and also he never saw the whole book as one. So we always gave him the book in fractions, so he would focus on small parts. Because if you give him the whole thing, it would be too heavy for him, you know. Also, like in the context of his own past. So the way to do it was to say like to get one chapter, and then you just get the text, and you have to look at the text if the things are correct. Because there was also sometimes mistakes in the text, and you wanted to change, like say for example, names or context.
We feel that in the book there is different kind of paper, like different qualities. Is it just holding us? Is it the reason why?
Yes, it's also because it's nice. No? but Rogério would always like as I said, his nickname was Rogério Chaos. So he would never talk about one thing. you would talk about this, and then it would suddenly be like, did you know the microphone was invented by this and this person, but when the recording of blah 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 happened at this concert, they didn't use this microphone, they used another microphone. And by the way, so he would always jump from one thing to the next. So this is very much also a little bit his character, that he had a lot of information always. He never left Brazil. He spoke fluent French, of course Portuguese, French, English, Spanish, Sanskrit he translated, and then when he arrived in Frankfurt, after 4 days he was translating Hölderlin, like from German into Portuguese. So it explains like what kind of character he was. It wouldn't also fit to him like to make a book which is like super like plain and one paper and everything in one, like, you know, it's much more about also diversity of information or diversity of knowledge, no? And how that can also inhabit a book, and it can also like then maybe a reader or someone who looks at it and again like have fun from it or enjoy it, you know? So this has a lot to do also with the design practice that I do, like to try and open that space, that it's not a one linear form of interpreting something or reading something, but that you try and open that there can be multiple ways of also reading it, no? Because many times it's also works that are still in flux, or that are works that are still developing, or that are still being understood. Like a lot of his works that were done in the 60s, of course they are understood by academics, but they still, the impact that they have on visual culture in Brazil, it's still in flux. The people in Brazil, they still listen to those albums. It's still the main music that we listen to in Brazil. So the aesthetic of it and
you feel it.
Huh?
You feel it.
Would you say that it's the book that you have devoted the most of your time in terms of implication, content, etc.?
Maybe, I don't know, but it's a book that's very close, of course, because I can also read, I could really also associate with his work. It was very important. So as a person, it's very important. So yeah, probably yes.
No, I'm thinking like if you provide as much time for each project, like you will be doing that many projects, because it's a lot of implication, engagement.
Yeah, in this case, of course, it's everything, because there we did everything from the beginning. It was like transcribing the stuff, you know, like scanning the stuff, selecting it, like finding the funding, finding these links to the show, doing the display. So it was involved in all the elements. So I briefly wanted to talk about this specifically because specifically in the School of Casablanca and its project, and I'm invited here in the context of, there's a lot of importance of artisans craft from Morocco, the history of it, and the influence it had on the painters of the Casablanca school. So maybe to extend a little bit, so I spent half of my time in Mexico. I have family there, my partners were there, and I spent over the years a lot of time there. And at one point, 2013, so almost 10 years ago, I was invited by a place called the Center for Design in Oaxaca to do an exhibition of the work of my studio. And the Center of Design in Oaxaca is in the south, and this book doesn't exist anymore. But it was a center for design that generated projects between designers and artisans. And Oaxaca is one of the places which has the highest density of artisans craft. So that in the south of Mexico we have a lot of pottery, we have a lot of weaving, we have a lot of tapestry. It's very active. It's not only part of tourist culture or selling it to tourists, but it's also part of daily life. So of course all indigenous communities, they still all of them actively use these products, and they use it in their daily life, and they are still active in the way that they are being made. So I found it particularly problematic to come in as a German white guy from Europe to basically work with this place and to say like, okay, we're now going to work with artisans and collaborate, because you always come in, of course, as an outsider or as someone who doesn't have that knowledge, and I also don't have the family history. So how do you negotiate about it? How do you collaborate with that, and how do you work around those questions? No? So in the end, we spent basically with my studio like 2 months, 3 months in Oaxaca, and we of course went to many workshops and many artisans, and we made many different stuff in the end, not just one, but many different things that resulted in different collaborations. So I'll just show them to you and you will understand. But so we didn't want to use, for example, plastic printed posters, so we used the weavers that make the pate. It's made from kind of straw. To make the title, and for that we weave the title into these straws, and we then use them as the posters for the exhibition. But you can also use them, of course. She helped us on doing this, Jimena, and different workshops. So this is a workshop for burning black clay. It's burned in the ground, and through the temperature, it's black. So we did different experiments, like also how to use the material different, or this is an artisan that makes, for example, Calizo makes baskets. His name is Adrian, with whom I still work today, because he had the monoblock plastic chair in his kitchen. And then I asked him, like, can you make the same basket you made, but as a mold for the plastic chair? So the way I didn't design the chair, I mean, he did the chair. It's his design, it's his thing. And it's also, he continues it, we still produce it with him, and sometimes he also makes it. And the idea was basically to focus more on products that come out of a globalized economy or globalized context, like this plastic chair that's everywhere and it's cheap and it's available, but to re-bring it back again into like the crafts, no? or in the local production context. This is a carpenter workshop that we worked with to build the structure for the exhibition, which you can see here on the left. And it's a community that manages their own forest, but also they have a carpentry workshop. And then the exhibition, we toured to different places. It was in Oaxaca and in Mexico City, and then also we went to Germany. But in the exhibition, basically, in the end, we had this structure, and in the structure, you had like different things that were related to the research, things we did, or projects that I did in my studio, or stuff we found, and that we then used to try to tell the story of those 2 months in Oaxaca. So, for example, these are different rejected black clay objects. So this is a book I made. It's a textile designs for Bless.
So this is black clay. The clay is already dark.
No, the clay is not dark. It comes through the oxidation process at a certain temperature, and when the oven is closed. So then the burning of the temperature, it settles on the clay and it makes the clay black. It's actually a very low temperature burning. It's not very high. So it's soft clay, but also it's not. You also have soft clay, which is higher temperature, but the black clay, it's not so high in temperature. But it comes from the actual burning process. But the clay is not black.
It's like more a kind of glaze.
It's not glazing. It's from the burning. It's the ash evaporates in it burns inside the closed, and then it goes into the clay through the temperature, and through that it turns black. And in the exhibition we also have a lot of good Sicilian objects that are part of daily life, or that are without necessarily of an author. For example, these are brushes made from different roots. But they talk also about these different forms of crafts, which are sometimes accepted or not. So, for example, this is a very typical design of a sword thing we use with the tacos. It's everywhere in Mexico, no one knows who designed it, you use it every day, but it's a plastic object, but it's also, yeah. So we also integrated this kind of objects into the exhibition. And we made a version of this table that I made a long time before already, but with the local woods from Oaxaca. That we can also fragment into different pieces. And there are the tests, and these are other chairs we make with different weaving techniques. Also connecting different carpets. Then we try to make the black clay also flat. You can see also here, like where it's broken, it's the normal color of the clay. This is another chair we designed with the guys who made the chopping boards for taco stands where you chop the meat. So they make very thick wood. You have the same here in Morocco actually. I saw on the market. It's very thick, pine wood, very soft. So the wood is not dry sometimes yet. It's still quite fresh. And the idea is also with the chair that it has the layers and it's an outboard chair. So after a while, through the wetness or through the humidity, the chair like you can see the way it bursts. Yeah, so that was that. And then, I mean, if you're interested also, there's more about this, but this exhibition basically, yeah, after these 2 months, we went to present it in this exhibition and we went to different places. And some of these objects are still being produced and they still have their own life, being made by the artisans.
And there is a website as well, where you can have access to all this furniture.
And this is another project which was more of a commission. It's a painter, Christopher Sara from Cyprus. He was very important in the context of Cyprus. So we were invited to do the graphic design and also the display for a new museum that opened in Cyprus. And the first exhibition was a retrospective by this painter. But the painter has already passed a long time ago. He died in the 70s. And the 70s? I forgot exactly. But basically, most of the works, they were the possession of families or private households. So a lot of these works, they were people's houses, hanging in flats, or people having in kitchens or in the bathroom. So this is the graphic design. We designed like different typefaces and posters. Then also there I worked with some artisans that work mainly on olive trees, making religious objects out of olive tree roots. And then I worked on different shelvings for the museum out of leftovers of olive trees. And then also these display stands where you could display postcards and also printed stuff. This is a typical shelving system that I made. It's like a modular system we used for the entrance of the museum. And then in the museum we split the exhibition into 3 floors. The ground floor was like the historic paintings by him, so the old ones. And I created like a space which was closed up with a metal strip, and the paintings were like floating in the middle of the space. So you could also walk behind them and see the information behind them. Like this, I won't talk about it now, but then there were white rooms which of course had historic material, and there was another floor which had more his latest works, which you can see here, and that floor we did everything more in like diagonal boxes that were crossing the spaces, and then you have the more contemporary works. And here, like for example, this was like photographs. He collaborated a lot with different architects, for example, buildings and murals, and also for example, this kind of concrete relief. This is like a concrete relief. So and they form part of different buildings. So actually, this book tries to document this. So here, what we did in this book is we took like the photographs that, for example, that we could find that he took of the paintings, and then sometimes we would take a photograph of where it was now. So, for example, this is in someone's flat. Like the person who owns the painting now and where it's hanging now. Or then we would also put in documentation of the exhibition. So trying to show different lives of where these paintings were basically existed. So this is a photograph that also he took while he was still alive. And then there's he was mainly known because he had a canteen in Cyprus, which was a restaurant where he would serve tea and food, and there he would do events, and they would also put like other artists to do exhibitions. And this was basically the first place ever in Cyprus to show contemporary art, because there was nothing else at the time in the 60s. And so you also find some photographs of this inside this book. And for the space, of course, he also made furniture and he made different things.
This is in Cyprus, not in Venice.
This is Cyprus. He also worked a lot with textiles, but then everything was like left. Everything he made, all the paintings, everything like leftovers he would find on the street. Like he wouldn't like go and buy materials. He would just always work with stuff he would find on the street. So we made 3 books. One which I didn't bring. This is the bigger one, which is like a real monograph, but there's like an overview of all his works. And then another one which is more of a structural thesis, and then this one which is more experimental. And then the exhibition afterwards we went to Venice, and then we installed it also there, but in a much smaller space. So there we had to tackle the way of how a lot less works, how you could show them in a much smaller space. So I made like a shelf which was running around all the edges of all the space. And you would have the paintings basically always level on eye level, all the works. And in the backyard you had the concrete reliefs outside. This is like a historic image from a show he made, and then he also copied some of his display and made like one room which was more like a storage space. And then I wanted to draw this. This is like a work in public space I did like a couple of years ago in Berlin. It's basically next to kind of where they make all the movies in Berlin. Babelsberg, and they also had Alfred Hitchcock there at one point studying. So I made it's the set of Alfred Hitchcock, and it's basically a rail that you can use also to sit on. To not be a bicycle. And this is a more recent work during COVID. We were asked to work with an outdoor space, which is in the middle of Berlin next to Alexanderplatz. But it's a space where they make concerts and also contemporary art exhibitions, only during the summer. And then we were asked to work with them on a kind of signage and display. So I came up with because they have basically a former cloister, it's a ruin. And on the back you have these graves, which you do not, when they have concerts or exhibitions, you're not supposed to access. So, but at night you can also go into this building because it's a ruin. There's nothing that protects it, there's no camera, so people can jump over the fence, they can steal things. So all the stuff I designed it so that it's super heavy, so you cannot move it. So I did everything with stones and steel. So for example, these are like very heavy dividers that you cannot access there. And then all the signage is made with like these half-ton stones that are basically resting on a metal steel plate. And then on the back side you have the information about the exhibition that's going on, or the artist. And then this is the bookshop. So here these are stones where I carved like little things in it. Some publications and books there. And in the summer they have these umbrellas in the shadow. And then for the colder period we designed for them an inflatable roof that you can inflate with an engine in like 20 minutes.
Wow.
Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, I can talk more, but I thought it was funny to see a little bit these things that I do in outdoor space. Because, for example, with my publishing house, for all these years, we try to always do events in outdoor spaces instead of doing stuff in bookshops. So what we do is like we go into a park, or we go into a parking lot, or we go into like something that's in the city, and then we do a creative program there. So I didn't put so many images now, but this is just one event. Actually, this is 2 events, but then we invite some people or friends that work with food. So this is a friend, Paula. She works mainly with food, and she then prepared like drinks, and she made plates out of soft clay that you can then eat the food, but you can throw it on the ground, and the clay becomes earth again. And then we have performances, so people will do a lecture on the book, and then we also spread like artworks in the park or in the city. And we normally do this in the summer, but it always depends. Every time it's different. So every time it's more in the context of like what the books that we are presenting, and then we invite what makes sense. Of course, the artists that are presenting the books, or friends that will talk about the book, or that will perform the relationship. But it's more like events that happen in public space. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, so this is like an edition, but then the edition was hidden in the kind of park. This is like a sculpture, which is like a massive chewing gum made out of clay, that it was lying in the park. Or this is an artwork also. It's an eye of a dog, but it's on a tree. And this was also, we did it, this specific one was during COVID, so it was 2 summers ago when it was a lot of COVID and people were really scared of going out. So it was a good way to do it because people could keep distance, and people didn't talk with other people, others who wanted. Yeah. And then, I mean, I used to have also a small bookshop in Berlin where we used to do this kind of stuff. I just threw it in the summer.
Yeah, I was going to ask you too.
But it's closed now. I stopped it. But it's a very tiny space. Basically, this was the size of it. And then we would also mainly sell books by other publishers and editions, and then do talks or stuff on the street, because the space was just like half of the size of this. But
What was the reason for the
that it was really tough during COVID to keep it running, and also, as you can see, I already do so many things, and to be a good bookseller, it's really another science. You have to really get a lot of time and space to it, and it's also really a good bookseller is there all the time. And I was not there all the time, and I was not really doing events and was taking care of it, but to really be there full time, it's very demanding. You have to spend a lot of time. Yes, you have to, as a bookseller, you have to restock stock, you have to sell, you have to establish a clientele, to buy stuff, and all those kind of things.
What's your distribution network? Do you have some bookstores you work with? What kind of volume do you publish? Those are good books, but how do you do the selling parts? If you don't do it yourself?
For the publishing house?
Yeah.
For the publishing house, we have distribution contracts. So we work with distributors, and then we also go to the small book fairs, and we also have a lot of bookshops that know our program, and they order directly from us, and we also have a web page.
So you have a network, you built a network.
Yes.
And there are book distributors in Germany. That's crazy to me.
I mean, not only in Germany. I mean, actually in Germany we don't even have a book distributor, but we have one in France, and then yeah, in other countries as well. But yeah, it's basically when a bookshop orders normally a book, they order it normally through a distributor. Not very rarely they order it directly from the publisher. In Europe or in the US as well. And this maybe last to finish off, this is what I've been working now the last 3 months. Still not finished, but the logo I didn't do it. This is made by Rodina, it's a graphic designer from Rotterdam, but it's a new space that's opening in New York actually in 2 weeks. It's called Kava, a Center for Art, Research and Analysis, and we designed the entrance space, so here you can see all the elements we designed. And this is how it's going to look. But basically what they are basically chairs in different scales and tables in different scales. So you have over-dimensional chairs and you have mini chairs, and you have over-dimensional tables and mini tables. And this is just like a couple of days ago now. They're being shipped there. They're done. These are the prototypes of the chair.
What is the space going to be? I didn't quite catch the.
It's a contemporary art space for contemporary art research and alliances. It's called. But basically, what they do is they do exhibitions. They have 2 floors for exhibitions, and they have an entrance space, and we designed the entrance space which will be used for a bookshop, but also for workshops and talks. So most of this furniture is made for that space for these interactions to happen and exchange. So that people can meet, and you can also have an exchange and a dialogue. A workshop can happen. They can look at books, or they can have a children workshop, or graphic design workshop,
And this idea of skills comes from you or from them? How did it come?
No, this is something we proposed. Yes. Yeah, so that's kind of it. If there are any questions, I'm very happy to answer. But yeah, I mean, this is like a small fraction of stuff, but most of the things in that sense that I showed you, maybe just to sum it up a little bit, really has to do also with the idea of that design can work as a, if you want to call it design or whatever, it doesn't matter, but what I try to do is to basically create things in the way that they can also be adopted and they can be appropriated in certain contexts, in a certain space. So for example, you can inhabit the space and then use it in different ways. So like the chairs, you can use them in different scales. They could be for big people or small people, they could be used for sitting, or they could be used for other things. In the same way that language is used in these books or typography to communicate a certain approach to an artwork or a certain knowledge or a certain trajectory of how something evolves, how that can also be explained or diverted into different ways, also of broadening up the conversation or broadening up the dialogue in the same way that when you make architecture, it doesn't necessarily afterwards become that. It can be reappropriated to something else, which is something like skating all the time. Like it was made as a fountain, but it's not the fountain that's interesting, it's the ledge that there's interesting that you want to sit, and then another person sits there and has their lunch. And so I very much come from this idea of how these things can also expand them, and how this design praxis or these different elements, you can use them in order to expand them.
Thank you, Manuel.
Thank you very much. I feel like work as a translator, so for the artist to translate the work, as you said, like to me, a personality into words. You're here in the context of the School of Casablanca.
Yes.
So I assume you might be working in the group right now, or what?
At the moment, it's the first time I'm here, and now at the moment it's basically it's the researcher to develop a project to develop here in the context of the Casablanca art school, and all the participants who are invited now to make a proposal, which will be at the end of the year. There will be a public program. At the end of the year, yes.
Yeah.
And then next year there will also be an exhibition.
Yeah, like really on a trip to get to understand how I'm feeling about Casa. Feeling about it, understand the context, do research with people, and then he will come back and propose something that attracts him.
Yeah, for sure.
And I wanted to ask you just how do you choose to work with this, like different artists? Like they propose to you, or you choose specific subject?
Yeah, I mean,
or you get interested in the subject, you see yourself on it, and you start working on it?
It always varies. I mean, at the very beginning, of course, the work I was doing was like commission work, to make a book or to make a graphic identity for something, or someone pays you and they ask you, can you do it? But this is now, of course, changed also. Sometimes I initiate the project, or I look for the funding of an idea and then try to generate it myself. But in most of the artist books, it's really the artists that then approach me, they want to collaborate or work with me. But in other projects, it's different settings. It's like this exhibition, now with the School of Casablanca, they approached me if I would like to be in this residency and participate in the project. So there will also be something coming out. But it always varies, it depends. There's not one way, but yeah.
But honestly, like coming across your practice, at least in my, for me personally, I got to understand more what design is about. You know, the added value you bring into it. Because from all your projects, like in the position of the artist or the institution or whatever contributor coming across you, there is a tremendous added value into the shape, into you really add something more to it. You know, you're not only an executor, you come to complement the vision. And really I found it fabulous. So quite impressive. It's not so common here. And we all agree. That's why I found it like you're cross-disciplinary, you collaborate, not usual.
I mean, it's also a search for that. You know, it's like you search for something, you search for a certain thing you want to do, and if you get so obsessed, then you try to repeat it, and then at one point, like, you somehow manage to do it, you know? So, like, if you think of art, you know, I really admire this artist, or I would like to work with him, or I would like to think about maybe doing this kind of thing, but you don't have money, or you don't have the tools, or you don't have the access to it. But then you start looking like, does the other stuff exist, or does it work, or what could be a possibility to make it happen, you know? And then if you keep it up, I mean, if you keep on moving, and insisting in moving and looking for it, it happens by itself. Like with Rogerio, it didn't happen that we went up to him. It was like we weren't, at the point when we met him, we weren't even thinking about making the course. Just we were curious who he was. Like, who is this guy? Like, he's like appears everywhere, and he's done this amazing work, and no one in Brazil ever talks about him. So when we met him, and he was like blowing our mind, we were like, shit, you really have to do this. We have to do something about it, because otherwise, like, he's gonna pass away, and people will forget about him, or that part of history of his work will never be written, because there were other books about him, but it's mainly focused on the texts or the graphic design. But it never tried to combine him as a person, like all the different things he was doing.
I'm also impressed, just to say, that you know, that thinking of this is such a quite amazing to get practice that kind of thing. I'm just curious, maybe it's not a question that we ask yourself, but do people like people? Do they enjoy reading them? Because
they enjoy what?
Reading them, for example, because they're quite visual and they're drawing by the colors, like images, and the typography is really so beautiful. I don't know if this idea of this question can help us.
The idea of what?
This question of like, okay, do people actually
read because
enjoy reading?
I don't know. Maybe, I don't know. Yes, I mean, I hope so, but
the question is,
I mean, it becomes much more difficult nowadays, of course, to make books. It is, as you said, it becomes something very precious. There are books that the books that I brought now, it's just a very small fraction, and then I've also designed books which are purely reading, just text. Actually, it was one, but
I have it at home.
But yes, but most of the books that you see here, they of course they have to do with contemporary art, they have to do with the visual culture, or they have to do with contemporary culture. So yes, of course, the image there or the documentation of the image in the form of the book is primarily there rather than let's say the literature. Sometimes the ones that you see there, that's many times the case. But it's also to play, you know, it's like many times like in Rogerius' case, the texts are super important, but they also have a totally different thing about the history of design or the history of counterculture. So I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah.
What size of the distribution do you have? Like, how many copies is there? 1,000, 10,000, 500?
I mean, most of these books that you see here, they are printed like an edition of like between 800 and 1,200. But Rogerius' book, for example, it's totally sold out.
That was going to be my next question. Where can I please get it from?
Yeah, his website and everything. It's sold out.
Yeah.
But it's here at ThinkArt. So you can have access to it.
Yes.
do you think maybe a book about skateboarding? Do you think?
If I can do it?
Yeah,
of course, yes.
You can do everything apparently.
Yeah, it would be nice, but I always ask myself what. But I mean, the way that I came to graphic design was through skateboarding. So the first stuff I did was, I mean, this is maybe now more interesting for but of course, when I started skateboarding, like 84, 85, it was in Germany. There was no decks, there was no boards. But I was living in a very American context because there was an American army base. So we had access to Thrasher and Transworld, skateboarding magazine. And the visuals of that, of course, it was very much counterculture. The designs of the boards, it was related to punk graphics, it was related to hip hop and punk graphics and counterculture. And this thing was very much graphic design. It was very much about the idea of like how you can associate with something like this, or how that is a counterculture and created also its own identity. And of course, as a kid, I was amazed with it. So I was copying his designs or drawing them, you know, and through that developed an interest in also in typography and letters and drawing and all that stuff.
You know what we should do?